First of all, I'd like to thank Ken for coming along. I think most of you might know Ken. Before I start, I'm going to give a plug to two publishers, and there is a particular reason for this. One is Five Leaves, who publish Ken's books and various others. They're there. And the other's a group called London Books Classics, who also reissue classic books about London. The reason I'm giving a plug to these two people is one of the things we'll be talking about is that for a long time Ken and me have been interested in trying to get Alexander Barron. First, other people have been interested in trying to get Alexander Barron and lots of other neglected London writers back into print. And we're pleased to say that in September, Five Leaves will be reissuing King Dido by Alexander Barron. And these are a group of another publishers who's trying to work in a similar area. And the reason why nobody can do as much as we'd like to do is the obvious reasons that nobody has the money to produce them all. But the more we can support these two presses, the better the chances of getting some of the authors that we feel have been much neglected back into print and into common parlance. Because I find nothing more frustrating than reading a book. I mean, a classic is Ken's when you read Doctors and Detectives and you get all these references, you think this sounds really interesting. You go to your local bookshop, 95% of them are out of print, you're then left with interlibrary loans and that. And also, if we could get them back into the print and get a buzz about them and get people talking about them again, I think people who are just who aren't fanatical about this but have just got a slight interest will see the books and pick up on them, because I think what these people, Ross, me, Ken and various other people feel are many neglected authors who should definitely be put back. And hopefully today Ken will be talking about part of our campaign to get Alexander Barron back into print, but also be obviously referring to his very influential books, Doctors and Detectives, which was one of the first books that talked about the influence upon political activists, some unsung political activists, and the creation of, I suppose, the Jewish and the East End novel. So I'd like to welcome Ken and hand it over to him, as he has far more expertise in these matters than I am. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. And thanks very much for coming along. Saturday 5 o'clock, summer evening, difficult territory. The talk is called Doctors and Detectives because it is based on a book that I originally researched and wrote in the early 1980s and was republished about 12 months ago. And it's really the story of the kind of that movement in the 60s and 70s to kind of rediscover British working class history. And so the first few minutes of the talk really is about why in the 60s and 70s there was this interest in it. I trained to be a teacher in the 1960s, and the emphasis very much then in trained to be a teacher was on self-expression and the kind of worlds that children and their parents have created that were often invisible. And there was a lot of emphasis in that time on reproducing the things that children wrote and talking to their parents, getting a lot of the experience of the communities in which the schools were based, somehow into the curriculum. And you'll remember publications like Jackdaw, where kind of social history was put into useful packs so that children could talk about, look at the history of different trades and industries and so on. And around that time there was this charismatic historian, and some of you probably heard him talk or met him or know him, Raphael Samuel, who was living in Elder Street in just off of Commercial Road in the East End of London, who was a tutor at Ruskin College. And he and others set up something which was called the Ruskin History Workshop. And they were very committed to the use of oral history to kind of try to rewrite the history of the 20th century within living memory through the words and experiences of people who actually lived in it. And that became a very, very, very strong movement. And we were kind of caught up in the enthusiasm of this movement. And so in Hackney in 1971, I was still teaching at Hackney Down School then, but the Centerprise Bookshop, radical bookshops play a very important part in this story, had just been set up, interestingly, by a black American draft resistor in Dalston Lane. And I was involved with partly the setting up of Centerprise, And one of the early things we did was to say that not only would this bookshop sell books, but we'd also try publishing them ourselves. So we set up an oral history project which was called The People's Biography of Hackney. But there were other influences at the time, and I think they are still worth recording because, as Malcolm said, the reason why I want to get a lot of these books back into print is not simply for nostalgic reasons or even kind of bibliographical reasons or historiographical reasons. It is the fact that I do believe that, in the words of 1984, we've been talking about Orwell earlier on, who controls the past controls the present, controls the future. And I think history is constantly being rewritten and reshaped and reconfigured by those who are currently in power and who control the school curriculum and who decide, what the kind of official discourses of how we got to where we are now, particularly, for example, since the Second World War. There's a battle always going on about interpreting the recent past, partly to explain how we get to where we are. So I do think this kind of going back to these movements and currents of thought is very important, and where we can, bringing a lot of that material back into the public domain. And there were some, apart from the kind of radical movement associated with the History Workshop movement, there were individuals like Charles Parker, who was a radio producer, and very adept in the use of a tape recorder, but he was also a folklorist and a folk music historian. And in the 1950s and 1960s he did a series of radio programmes for the BBC, which were called the Radio Ballads, in which he mixed tape-recorded voices and music, particularly from industries like coal mining, whaling, fishing, agricultural work and so on. And this, this kind of documentary tradition really was very strong. There were other people I think equally interesting, such as Tony Parker, who was the British equivalent, or the English equivalent of Stubbs Turk in America. Tony Parker did a succession of very important books on social policy, but they were based on tape-recorded interviews. He did several books about long-term prisoners. He did books about men who ran the lighthouse system around the coast. He did books about, interviewed everybody in one particular tower block in South London. But it was this kind of experience from below that was being published. So this movement, and why I got interested in this work that eventually became Doctor's Detectives, was really very strong. But it wasn't without quite a lot of argument. And I won't go through all of them, but I mean there were the real purists who said that if you tape recorded someone you had to reproduce every and ah and kind of poor grammatical mistake or whatever, because this was still the authentic speech. And there were others who said, well, you should do some editing in order to make this person not sound quite as stupid as we all sound or all appear if we were simply tape recorded crudely and then let it all just published out. And therefore the key role which was up for debate was what was the role of the editor or the transcriber. And I think that raged and was quite vitriolic at times. What is the role of these people who are kind of doing this intermediary work of turning tape recorded or transcripts into books? So the People's Autobiography in Hackney started in 1971, and it was actually started as a WA class, the Workers' Educational Association class. It was completely voluntary. And the tape recording was done by people who turned up to the class, and they were themselves a very mixed group of people, including some of my own sixth form students. And we, to our shame, and I mean it really is shame, we were so, we're not idealistic, well we were idealistic, but we were dismissive of kind of bourgeois preoccupations with technical ability.